Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I am here with the final installment of shopping my stash for my Chop My Block items. I do have 15 palettes on my shopping block this year, and these are the last two that I have to go through. So I'm going to go through and see if I can dupe these palettes out. We do have the Eternal Eclipse palette from Luna Beauty, looks like this. And then we have the Blueberry Muffin palette from BH Cosmetics. Both of them do have a bit of blue, a bit of neutral. They're actually quite similar. I think I might even compare these two at some point as well in this video. But I do also have some palettes to compare these two separately. I have quite a lot more to compare with the Eternal Eclipse palette than I do with the Blueberry Muffin because, yeah, I feel like originally you feel like, oh, it's just going to be like a cool tone blue palette. But you do also have these neutral pops in here as well, which makes it a bit more versatile and you have more to compare. Whereas with this one, there are different undertones and a lot more kind of blue, purpley, periwinkle kind of undertones, so less to compare with this specific palette. So I'm actually going to start with the Blueberry Muffin because I have less to compare. But before jumping into the comparison, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. Let's jump into the video. So here we have the two palettes compared. I have swatched them out on my arm so you can see what the differences are. For these two palettes, since I am comparing both of them in this video, I want to swatch out as many similar shades as I could just to see how many are actually similar. So some of these are definitely not exact, but I wanted to include similar colors. So up here on the top, we have two kind of more neutral tone shades. We have actually the first shade in both palettes right here. For these two in the Blueberry Muffin, we don't really have anything similar. But for the deep brown here, we have the shade 350 Degrees and the shade Earthbender. Very, very similar kind of shadows. Again, for the more neutral shades here, we don't have anything similar. However, for the two grey mattes, we have Smoke from the Luna Beauty palette, and then we have Treat from the Blueberry Muffin palette. Next up, we have two warm browns. Again, somewhat similar, a little bit different. This one is a little bit more just kind of warm reddish undertone, whereas this one is a little bit more peachy. But this is Summer Sky from the Luna Beauty palette. And then we have, actually no, this is 350 from the Blueberry Muffin palette. This one here is the shade Decadent. But yeah, that's those shades. Next up, we probably have the two most different shades so far. We have the shade Lagoon from the Luna Beauty palette. The shade in the Luna Beauty palette is definitely a bit more kind of taupey, whereas the other one is a bit more kind of pink-purple undertone. But I guess they give somewhat similar vibes. The black are basically exact dupes. Both of them are black with glitters in them. Those are the shade Night Sky and Baker's Dozen. Again, very, very similar shades. The silver are also very similar. The one in the Luna Beauty palette is more reflective, and that's the shade, how do you say that? Adamantium, I think, versus Hot and Fresh. For this light blue, we don't really have anything similar. And then for these two here, we have the shade Fluffy versus the shade Dusk. Dusk's definitely more kind of camel undertone, whereas Fluffy is more peach, but I wanted to compare them anyway. And then same with the last two, aren't very similar either. We have the shade Stud Muffin versus the shade Starry Eyed, and Starry Eyed is definitely more just kind of steel gray, whereas the other one is a bit more kind of purpley, black and purple blue, I guess. So those two are the two palettes compared. That's all of the similar shades. Yeah, I just thought it would be fun to compare these two as they are in the same video, and they are somewhat similar vibes. Next up, we are comparing the Blueberry Muffin palette to the Subliminal palette from Pat McGrath. These are the comparisons here. Again, not too many shades, honestly, that's similar, but I wanted to go through the ones that are, because I don't have too many palettes with like blue undertones in them. So let's go through them in order. First up, we have the two first shades again in the palette. This one here, I couldn't really decide which one it was similar to because it's quite similar to a lot of the light shimmery shades in the Blueberry Muffin palette, but I decided to go with Sweet. Then for the next three shades, we don't have anything similar, which is the top row in the Blueberry Muffin palette. However, for the second row, we have the shade Sugared, which are compared to this gold shade. They're not super similar, but the shade Sugared have a little bit of a kind of yellow gold shift to it. So I wanted to compare them anyway, but honestly, they're not super similar. Next up with our row, we have the gray shade here. And that is compared to the kind of dark gray matte in the Subliminal palette. But again, not very similar. This one is definitely more brown undertone, which is this one is like a pure gray. Again, nothing similar for the next two shades. Then we have this blue here, which is the blue kind of baked special shade in the Pat McGrath palette. I compared that to the shade Tempting, but honestly, they're not mega similar again. This one is more similar to this shade here in an undertone, but obviously this one is a shimmer versus this one that's a matte. These two shades are quite similar actually. This is the other kind of special shades here compared to the shade Yummy. They are very similar, but obviously this shade is way more impressive. And I feel like this one would actually maybe be a mix between like this as a base and then this on top. But since we're doing shade by shade, I just decided to go with a special shade. Then we have the matte black compared to the black in the Blueberry Muffin palette. They are very similar. For the silver here, I decided to go with this shade here, which is actually an iridescent blue. But they are the most similar, so I decided to compare them. And then lastly, we have these two here, which is that kind of black and blue purple shade again, and I compare that to this taupe. Again, not very similar, but they are similar in texture, so I decided to compare them anyway. But those are the comparisons from this palette. The final palette that I'm comparing is the Kaleidos Club Nebula palette, and honestly guys, this one is a stretch, but I really don't have much similar to the Blueberry Muffin palette. So these are the shades in here that are similar. Again, very much a stretch. We have this shade here, which is the shade You're My Only Hope, which is this kind of purplish shade there, and I compare that to this shade. They are similar. I think they're probably two of the most similar shades here. Then we had this kind of grayish purple here, which I compare to the gray, but obviously this one is way more purple leaning as well as darker. For the two blue, I compared the shade Void with So Good. Again, very different, but I wanted to compare. Another pairing that is kind of similar is the shade Astro and the shade Tempting here. Again, those are probably two of the more similar shades. Then I do have this shade here, which is shade Nova, compared to the silver shade again. Nova is similar to the Pat McGrath palette, more of an iridescent shade, kind of with a blue-purple shift, but I wanted to compare them. For the light blue, this one is definitely more turquoise, whereas this one is more true blue, and that is the shade Delish versus 7 of 9. And then lastly, for the peach shades, we have the shade Samus versus Fluffy, which again aren't very similar. So not the most similar, guys, but I still wanted to include them in case you do have these palettes, and honestly I don't have too much similar to the Blueberry Muffin palette. So here is my dupe palette for the Blueberry Muffin. It's not exact. I just realized that I don't have exact colors for these. These undertones are very unique in my collection, but let's go through the dupes that I have. So here we have my swatch. By the way, don't mind my hands, they're super dirty. I'm gonna wash my hands before I start the next palette. But let's start from the top. So here we have Meteorite from Terramoose. We have Hopscotch from Makeup Geek. We have My Treat from Colourpop, and Love and Happiness from Sydney Grace. That is the first row. For the second row, we have Snow Globe from Terramoose, Tiara from Sydney Grace, Legendary from Sydney Grace, and lastly we have the shade Sweet Tooth from Sydney Grace, and that is the second row of the palette. Moving on to the third row, here we have hashtag It's a Boy from Sydney Grace. Here we have Catalyst from Cleona. We have Abrasion from Cleona. And here we have Let's Do It from Colourpop. Again, that is the third row. Then for the last row here, we have Schlagier from Glam Shop. We have Perfect Storm from Sydney Grace. We have Champs from Colourpop. And lastly, Storm Cloud from Sydney Grace. So here are my swatches. There's a lot of things that differ. You know, I don't really have a periwinkle like that. I feel like the neutral shimmers are quite similar. Some of them are a bit more unique, but I feel like it creates a bit more variety in the palette. The grays aren't exact, but similar, same as these browns. The blues are definitely different. This is more turquoise. I realize I don't have a lot of blues with this exact undertone. These two are very similar. This just has a shift to it, same as these two. The blacks are very similar. This here has a shift to it as well, but I don't really have a true silver in my singles collection like that, but I don't use them very often. Again, the blues have different undertones. These two are quite similar, and then these two, again, have different undertones, but these are the comparisons for the Blueberry Muffin palette. So, to sum up this palette before I move on to the next, I have realized that I have a lot of shades in here that are unique to my collection. I don't have these undertones a lot in my collection. The problem is for me that I don't reach for this palette very often. I don't reach for these type of shades very often, which is why I'm thinking about decluttering this palette. I do feel like if I were to declutter this palette, I would for sure depot some of these shades in my collection. I would just get rid of my least favorite shades. So I would for sure depot like the 3 blues, because the undertones again are very unique to my collection, maybe even this grey. I do also like the undertone of these 2 shades, so I might even keep those. But then like things like this black and this shade here, I don't really use, same as the silver like I mentioned. I have a similar enough shade for this one here that I probably wouldn't keep that. I do like these two shades too, but I do have similar things that are better, so maybe I wouldn't keep them. And again, all of the neutral shimmers I have over and over in my collection. So that's kind of where I'm leaning if I were to get rid of this palette, but I'm still umming and ahhing whether it's worth just keeping the palette as a whole or whether to depot it. So that is the Blueberry Muffin palette. So moving on to the Toner Eclipse palette, we have it right here. And this is going to be the next one we compare. First up, I want to compare it to the Subliminal palette from Pat McGrath. Yeah, I mentioned this one before and I wanted to compare these two first. So here we have these swatches. So let's go through them. Up here we have these two, which are quite similar shades. We have like the first shade here and the first shade in this palette. I feel like these always happens to be in the first, like in the palette. So that's the first shade, very similar. For the silver, the one in the Pat McGrath palette isn't very similar. It's this one here, which is a blue iridescent again, similar to how we compared it in the Blueberry Muffin palette. These two shades are relatively similar. This one is a bit more kind of dimensional. It has more black blue sparkles to it, and that is this shade here. For the gold, again, they're very different. This is more like a teak gold, and this one is more like a gold kind of topper shade, and it's also way more yellowy, and that is this shade here. For these three shades, we don't really have anything similar, which are the last two shades on the first row, and then the first shade on the, the last shade on the first row and the first two shades on the second row. And then for the middle shade here in this palette, we have compared it to this one, but that shade is way more cool toned, but I wanted to include them anyway so you can see the comparison. For these two dark shades, which are these two here, we don't really have any comparisons again. And then moving on, we have like two gray tones, which are these two in the Pat McGrath palette compared to these two. But the one in the Moonlit Seduction palette is way more kind of bluish gray, whereas these ones are more like taupey grays. Then for the blues, we have this blue here compared to that blue, but this one is more turquoise, this one is more cobalt. For the matte blue, we don't have anything. And then for the black, we have the matte black compared to the shimmery black. So a few overlapping shades in this palette. Like, I wouldn't say it's mega similar. There's a couple shades up here that are similar, but there's more differences than I thought. For the next palette, we have the Biba palette, which when you first look at the palettes, you might not think are super similar because this one has so much darkness and blues and stuff like that. But there's a lot of neutral tones in here that you also have in this palette. So here are the comparison swatches. And I even think this might be a better comparison than the Subliminal palette. Yes, it is lacking on the blues, but all of the neutral tones are pretty much spot on. So these two here shades are very, very similar. We have the shade Monroe. For the silvers, we don't really have anything. Same for the antique gold, we don't have anything again. But for the bronze, we have something super similar, and that's the shade Rustic here compared to Desert Sky. And yeah, those two are very similar as these two. So I feel those are pretty spot on. Same with the next one, which is the shade Prairie compared to Dusk. Very similar tones. We don't really have anything mauve in the Biba palette, so nothing there. But here we have the shade Freckle, which again is quite similar. So is this one here, which is the shade Pasha, which is this one here. That is quite similar to Summer Sky. Then for Earthbender, we have the shade Seed, which is a bit more cool toned, but you know, it's a deep brown, so it gives a similar vibe. But yeah, this one is definitely more cool toned. This one is definitely more kind of reddish undertoned. For the silvery kind of gunmetal here, we don't have anything to compare. For the gray, I've compared it to the shade Tour, but this one again is more kind of blue leaning. This one is a bit more kind of taupey leaning again. And then for the blues, we don't have anything. And for the black, I have compared it to Spot. So those are the shades here from the Biba. And again, a lot of surprising dupes. Sticking with the Natasha Denona palette, I have one more here to share, which is the gold palette, which again, you might not think is the same because this one is the very gold and obviously like, you know, very warm tone leaning, whereas this one is more cool tone leaning. But there are again a few kind of overlapping shades, which I have included here. So you definitely have these turquoises, which you have also in the Luna Beauty palette, but these are a little bit more green leaning, whereas these are a little bit more blue. Also, this here might be a bit similar to this gray, maybe even more so than the blue, but I compared it to the blue because that's what I initially thought. For this deep brown, again, we have the shade here, which I think is the shade Log. That one is definitely more cool tone, so not super similar. However, these browns are quite similar, which we have this one here and this one here. And then for the bronzy shade, I have used this shade here. And for the gold, I used this shade. but I know this one is lighter and brighter, but I feel like they have that kind of antique reflex to them, so I included that one. But I think you probably could have also used like one of the deeper light golds, like for example this one. And then for the lightest shade here, I have compared it to this one, which I know is Kava, so that is that comparison. And again, there is a few shades in here that are overlapping more again than I thought. We have gone back to another Pat McGrath palette, and this is the Moonlit Seduction palette, which actually looks quite similar on an overview. So here are the comparisons. In this end here, we have quite a lot. We have like a light shade here, which is the first shade in the Pat McGrath palette. For the silver, I compare it to this one. The undertone is definitely different, but kind of similar. These two aren't super similar. We have the third shade in this palette, and then the special shade right here. That one has like a brown base and a blue shift, but you know, I still wanted to compare them. This one has a little bit of blue shift to it, so I wanted to include it. For the antique bronze gold kind of thing, we don't have anything. And then for the bronzer shade here, I've compared it to this shade, which is definitely lighter, but again, similar. For the two browns here, we actually don't have anything, but we do have some for the other ones, so opposite to like the last couple palettes that we had. For this one here, I have included this shade, and for the other one, I included that shade. They are a little bit deeper, but I think they work in a similar way, and I know Pat McGrath mattes can be sheared out quite a lot. For the deep shades, they're not very similar at all, to be honest. This one here is this one, which is way more cool toned. I think I could probably also compare this to like either the grey or the black more than this one. These two as well are quite similar. I have included this shade, which is actually that one. It looks way brighter in the pan, but it is quite a smoky shade when swatched out. And then for the last shades here, I don't have anything again. So that is the Pat McGrath Moonlit Seduction palette. The next palette I'm going to compare to is the Soft Glam palette, which is another neutral palette. So of course I'm going to mainly compare like the top two rows of the palette. So here we have the swatches, and again you can see there's a lot of overlap in this area, but not so much in this area. So let's go through them. Here I have compared the shade Fairy. Then for the next three, we don't really have anything similar. And for this one here, I compared it to Bronze. I would say Bronze is almost like a mix between, I mean, it's somewhere in between these, I would say. It's like a little bit more bronzy than green leaning, but it's lighter like this one. So maybe I should compare this to here, but I feel like it's kind of in between these two. For this shade here, I compared it to Burnt Orange. Here we have Dusty Rose. We have the shade Rustic, Sienna, and Mulberry. And again, these here are very, very similar. All the mattes are quite similar. And then down here we have the shade Noir, of course, compared to the black. So that is the Soft Glam palette. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap in the neutral tones. I feel like these here are the more unique shades. So it's quite interesting. Also like these here, I feel like are unique. So it's always like the middle parts here that I feel like I have in a lot of palettes, which are of course the more neutral tone mattes, which makes sense. So next up we have another Anastasia palette. This is the Carly Bible palette, which is this one here. And I feel like this is when we're starting to get into like a bit of a stretch. So here are the shades, and some of them are similar, and I feel like in the palettes I thought they would be more similar, but there's a few differences. These two shades here, which are quite similar, is the first shade in the palette and the shade Moo. I think they're quite similar. This one is a little bit more golden though. We don't have a silver like this, but then for this one here, I actually decided to compare it to OA. But I think in undertone is maybe a little bit more similar to this shade here, which is the one next to it called Jode, or even Libra, or somewhere in between. But since OA has those like multicolored sparkles in them, or in it, I thought it would be the closest, so I decided to compare that one. For the like kind of antique golds, they're very, very similar, and I compared it to My Angel. I don't really have anything for these two here. And then for this mauve tone, we have the shade Bible. Here we have the shade Shy. This is probably one of the most stretchy shades, actually both of these are. And then we have the shade Stev and the shade Boy, which, yeah, I feel like are not the same really. And then lastly here we have the shade Jode, which, not sure if that's the same. Maybe I should have taken Libra instead, but I think that one is more taupey. Yeah, you can see that there. So yeah, not really very similar, and then obviously nothing for the black. So not super similar, probably could have skipped this one, but I wanted to include it because of the antique bronze. Obviously these shades here, and I want to see how the more kind of grey silvery tones compared. So I think those are all the things I'm going to swatch out. I have two palettes for like honorable mentions. First up we have the Sultry palette from Anastasia. I think initially I thought there was a lot of shades because this one is also like cool tone leaning. It has some silvers, some bronzes, things like that. But looking at them shade by shade, there's not too many. I mean, these two are very similar. I think this one is way more pink tone than this one here. Don't really have anything for this. For this one, we could have maybe gone for steampunk, but it's not as antique as that one. For this one here, we probably could have gone for teak, but again, I don't think it's too similar. And then for the mattes, I thought it's going to be more similar shades, but I really don't think there's that many. I think birch could be similar to either dusk or sandstorm. There's nothing as cool tone as this one. We don't have anything like this shade here. And same with Noir. I mean, Noir would be same to this one, I guess. And then Slate would have been compared to this one, but Slate is definitely not as blue toned again. And then obviously we don't have any of the blues. So, like, I don't think there's anything exact, which is why I decided to not compare these, but I thought I wanted to share them like next to each other like this anyway. And then the last palette I have is this one right here, which is another Pat McGrath palette. Let me zoom out a tiny bit. Here. So these two, I think, again, aren't mega similar. There's a couple shades maybe that, you know, overlap. But the more I looked at them, the more I feel like there's not. Like, we have a mauve tone in both, we have a warm brown in both, but this one is more red tone, this one is more like chocolatey. We have these shades which are in a lot of palettes. This one here is, I guess, closer to silver, but this one is more silver, this one is more kind of warm toned, I guess. We have a bronze, but this one is more cool toned than this one. I mean, this one here maybe is a bit more rosier, so maybe closer. But yeah, not super similar. I think this is probably the least similar palette. I mainly saw like the mauve tone here and compare that, but I didn't want to swatch them out. But that is the last palette before we go into my dupe palettes. So here we have my dupe palette that I decided to pick out. So let's go through the shades. Here are the swatches. So let's go in order. First up here we have the shade My Treat from Colourpop. Then we have the Pastel Roses Moon. We have Sydney Gray's Travel Elegance. We have Cleona Weathered. I think this is Weathered or Patina. Weathered, yeah. Then we have this Colourpop shade. I can't remember what it's called, but it's not marked on the back, but I will insert it on screen. Moving on to the second row, which are right here, we have all Sydney Gray shades. We have the shade Camel, Predictable, Taffy, Piper's Piping, and Sweet Tooth. So those are those there. Then we have another Sydney Gray shade. It's the shade Storm Cloud. We have another one here called Thunderbird. Then we have a Cleon eyeshadow here, which is Crown Glass. We have another Sydney Gray shade, which is the shade Hashtag It's a Boy. And lastly, we have Terra Moon's Dark Side. I think Dark Side, right? Yes, Dark Side. So those are my swatches. I think I did a pretty decent job. Some of these aren't exact, but I think this one is quite close. This here is a multichrome. I really don't have a pure silver like this in my collection. But this one here it has like a blue base and a pink shimmer, but I feel like it turns out quite like silver on the skin, which you might be able to see, like silver with a pink shift, which is really beautiful. These two are not exact. This one is a bit more gray tone, this one is a bit more like dimensional and has some purple to it. Like, let me swatch that a little bit more there. Yeah, these two are similar. This one is a jewel multichrome though, so it has like a shift to it. I don't think you're gonna pick it up on camera, but it goes into like a bright green, but it still has that antiqueness to it. These two I feel like are quite similar. This one is a little bit more kind of warm toned and not as deep. For the mattes, I'm pretty happy with most of them. This one is a little bit more red toned, this is a little bit more pale, but overall they're very, very similar. Over here we also are quite similar. I think these are probably the best dupes I've had for these so far. I feel like the grays are quite similar. The shimmer gray is a little bit different. This one is almost a little bit more blue tone in this case, and this is a little bit more taupe, but overall very, very similar. Then we have another jewel multichrome from Cleona. This one here is the shade Chrome Glass, which has that same kind of turquoisey blue, like quite blue but a little bit turquoise to it main shift, but then it goes into a purple as well. I think you should be able to see the blue shift on camera, but it goes into like a bright purple, as well as like almost like a gold and a green at the very harsh angle. These two shades are very similar. This one is a little bit less turquoise, but it's very similar. And then for the blacks, I opted for actually a shimmery black that is actually shimmery. This is the best shimmery black if you're looking for one. This is the shade Dark Side from Terra Moons. I could have gone for a matte black too, but I thought it would be more fun to finish off with a sparkly black because this one has a bit of sparkle to it. But yeah, I just wanted to have one that is actually sparkly. So that is my dupe for the Luna Beauty palette. and I'm very, very happy with it. I think I did a pretty decent job. With this palette, I do like it. I feel like there's a lot of tones in here that I don't really have in a lot of palettes, but I was able to dupe it out pretty well when I did dupe it up now. It is, I don't know, this bottom row here isn't my favorite. I don't really like those really deep shades, but this here is actually really nice, and it's something that I'm really, really attracted to. Yes, these three are a bit of a deeper kind of shimmer, but this here is a really beautiful shade. This silver is really stunning, and this one is very interesting as well. And then this row matte is so buttery, so beautiful, and the tones are stunning. So yeah, I really, really like the top first rows, and the bottom row here is the one that's kind of throws me off. But it's also funny because this bottom row is what I like connect the palette to. I feel like this is like what I think of when I think of the Eternal Eclipse palette. I think of like the really smoky blue kind of shadows, but there's a lot of other things too. There's almost like some warmthness here, a lot of lightness too, and yeah, so I need to rethink how I look at this palette. Overall, I actually haven't used this one on my eyes yet. I am still gonna do that. It's actually like in my drawer now to try to reach for, and obviously I'm trying to reach for everything this year, and this is something that I've still yet to reach for. I think once I play around with it, I will be able to make a better decision on it. I have actually tried to get these shades out because they are like the same size as like regular singles basically, so you can see that there hopefully. So I was hoping like that I could take these out and like the pans were magnetic to replace like the bottom row maybe and make my custom palette, but the pans are magnetic, but they are glued in, which is unfortunate. So if I could get like some of these shades out, I would, and I would play around with the palette. But the good thing to note is that if I do want to depot this palette, the pans are magnetic, so I could just keep what I want and I don't have to repan them. So I have to think about it. I do want to play around with this palette, like I said, more. I don't think it's fair to declutter this one before I actually want it on my eyes, so I'm going to play around with it and see what I think of it. And again, I just need to rethink the palette and not just look at the bottom row because these shades here are really stunning. So there you have my next installment of my shopping block Do You Need Them series. This is actually the last one as well. I have now gone through all of the palettes on my shopping block. I will do in December a wrap up of my shopping block where I go through the palettes and see if there's anything that I want to declutter or not. I've had a lot of requests to not stop this series, so who knows, maybe next year I will continue doing this with the rest of my collection too, just seeing what's close, or maybe it's even just like duping them out with the singles. Let me know down below if you would be interested in me just doing it with my singles, or if you want me to compare as well. It is a lot of work, like, I'm not gonna lie, it's a lot of work to bring out all the palettes and swatch and compare and things like that. But I really find it interesting, and honestly, it's also really helped my like splurging on makeup. I feel like this made me realize that I don't need much more makeup. Like, I have everything that I need for sure. Like, I have more than I need. I have so many duplicates in my collection. And yes, I will probably continue to wear my makeup, but I'm going to probably focus on more special shades, like, you know, these kind of things here, like special in the eyeshadows. You know, I'm just pulling out the ones that I used to use for this palette. I like to buy better versions of these, but even so, I don't need to buy so many different things. So yeah, that is my little, I guess, roundup of this little series. Again, if you do want me to continue this one next year, maybe not with my shopping block, but in general, let me know how you want me to like redo this concept. Again, if you want me to just dupe it out with my singles or do exactly what I have been. But I feel like if I did it with every single palette, there would be a lot of overlap. So again, let me know what you want to do. But that is it for today. I really, really hope you're having a lovely day wherever you are, and I will catch you in my next one. Bye, guys.